Alright, this is our fourth video on ecology, and we've done a whole bunch in A on your notes, which is studying populations, and we've even started to get into community interactions with trophic levels on the last video. What we're really going to focus on today, I'm going to call it B for that section of your notes, is diversity and changes in ecosystem. So we're going to talk about succession, we're going to talk about keystone species, and we're going to talk about overall things in an area that can make it more likely or less likely for that ecosystem to thrive. Now, as we do our notes today, I have a lot of key things from the book, and I expect you to use those diagrams, those key things from the book, to look back in the text. Find that information, add it to your Cornell notes. I should really see some great beefed up Cornell notes compared to what I've been seeing this time. Also, the information that I have, so for example, I go right through where it is in the book. So this is 54.2, so chapter 54, and you just find point 2 of it. You don't have to write every word here, and notes should really never be in complete sentences. So these are highlighted things from the book that I want to talk about. So you decide which ones and how you will abbreviate it in your notes. That's really an important skill for college, because a professor doesn't say, oh, write down this, write down this. They're going to really explain stuff, and you need to decide, okay, what do I need to write down from this to make sure that I understand it when I study. So we're going to start off with talking about dominant and keystone species, and the reason why we talk about them is because they're so important to an ecosystem. A dominant species means that it has the greatest number. And I want you to think right now, greatest in number, greatest in biomass, what part of the ecosystem should that be? Hopefully you just told yourself producers, because producers are the ones that are doing photosynthesis using the abiotic factor of the sun to actually make carbohydrates, which is therefore going to give mass to those that eat it. So, very important that they are the dominant species. All right. Species diversity. When we talk about diversity, we're looking at how many different species are there in an area, how rich is it. So the variety of organisms that make up the community, we look at two things. The richness. Richness means how many are there, the number of species. And we look at abundance. Abundance means of each of those different species, how much are they compared to the total. So I have a little diagram just to exhibit it, again, right from your book. This community has 4 different types of trees, as does this community. But you will notice the abundance is very different. So this one, it's pretty evenly spaced out, the number of A, B, C, and D trees. This one, the majority of the trees are all A. Now, I'm hoping that you're thinking to yourself, okay, this matters because, and the reason why, if there is some sort of disturbance, some sort of ecological change that's going on, maybe in the predators that are present, the things that are eating these trees, maybe in a fungus or a mildew, something that might cause a problem to these trees. If the trees are mostly the same, it could wipe out this population. It's not very diverse if so many of them are the same species. Here, if it just affects A trees, at least it's only wiped out part of the population. It's still a diverse ecosystem that has a greater chance of survival. All right. Species with a large impact. So we're going to talk about dominant species and keystone species. Those have the greatest job or role in their ecosystem. So first of all, dominant means they're the most abundant. Usually we say these are the producers. They have the greatest biomass. Therefore, the level of them will determine every remaining trophic level. So for example, if an organism, a plant, is really very efficient at photosynthesis, that means it's very capable of using the sun's energy and making sugars, making food. So it would be a very, very likely a rich community because it's able to support a lot of life because it's doing a lot of photosynthesis. Other species of plants that are less effective at using the sun, chances are they're not going to be able to support as much growth, as much diversity, as many trophic levels. So let's keep moving on here. All right, keystone. Keystone species are organisms that play a role that is so important in that environment that if you take them out, the whole thing might fall apart. So I want to use some examples And I want you to look up these examples in your book and write them down in the Cornell Notes section. So I want you to find out about this sea star and the impact that it has on the environment. So I expect in the notes part for you to put sea star, and then over in the Cornell Notes section, which you might even be splitting your page half and half by this point, I want you to figure out what this experiment was and why is that a keystone species. Here is another one, and I'm going to explain this one a little bit. Here is a sea otter, and this is where it falls in a food chain. So at the bottom of the chain is kelp, and sea urchins eat the kelp, and sea otters eat the sea urchins, and orcas, killer whales, eat the sea otters. So sea otters, they're not necessarily the top predator, although often the top predator is a keystone species, whereas if you remove that top predator, you're going to throw off the balance of the entire ecosystem. But here they notice that if you take out this one link, the sea otters, so way back here, back in 1972, sea otter numbers were really, really high in kelp forests, areas of the ocean where there's an abundant amount of kelp. And if you reduce the amount of otters, the amount of sea urchins is going to go down. All right, wait, sorry. First of all, if I bring this down, I just read that wrong. If I have a really high number of this, they're eating a lot of these sea urchins, so the sea urchin population went down, and the sea urchins are what we're eating the kelp, so the kelp level goes up really high. I want to hit that before I jump over here. All right, when the level of otters goes down, because it's eating so many of these, it's running out of a food source, when this goes down, and we have very little sea urchins left, nothing to eat here, what happens to the kelp? The kelp actually, we don't have a number here, but it was high, and it actually ends up being wiped out. As you have less otters, if this number goes down, now this population can go up. So it's a constant thinking about when will it go up, when will it go down. If I have a lot of otters, they're eating this, so this level will go down, and this level should go up because there's nothing to eat it. Now, if the opposite happens, if I have a lot of sea otters, then they are going to be eating these sea urchins, and again, less of them means this goes down. Take this out of the picture, and what's going to happen if I remove my keystone species? Now the level of this goes way up, which means instead of the kelp being high, when the sea urchins are high and the sea otters are low, the kelp forests are being removed. If you remove the bottom level of your trophic pyramid, your pyramid of biomass, your pyramid of energy, if you remove that, chances are you're going to wipe out the whole chain. Less food means less of these. We already had a few number of these. If there's less food available, they will go down as well. So if you really have to look at the overall picture and see what's going on if we remove a certain species. And if it has a drastic effect, we call that a keystone species. Another example that I can just explain to you is elephants. So elephants in a savanna tend to be a keystone species. They're not dominant, they are certainly not the greatest in number, but what they do has a great impact. They tend to remove a lot of wood. And when they remove wood, and you can picture an elephant and its trunk and it wraps around a tree, and it tends to break up the soil and break up the environment and change things around for a lot of other organisms. When they break up wood and get decomposition going and they get grass available for more growth, more organisms can live in that savanna. If you take the elephants out, which has happened in the recent past, when the elephants are gone, all of a sudden all those trees are still on the ground and there's not a chance for growth to come up underneath them, and chances are the species that would eat the grasses, they're going to decrease in population because the grasses aren't available because the elephants weren't moving the trees out of the way. So keystone species has an impact on many different levels of the trophic system. Don't have to be the most abundant. All right, there's two ways of looking at the control of a trophic level. You can look at the bottom up. Bottom up means look at the bottom, and if you take the producers and you change their amount, if there's less producers, then you can have less primary consumers. If there's less primary consumers, you can have less secondary consumers. If there's less secondary, you can have less tertiary. That's what bottom up means. You're affecting it from the bottom level up. There also can be top down, which means if you remove a predator, so like you remove lynx from a population, you are now allowing this population to increase. So let's say I removed the third level of consumer. My secondary consumers now increase in frequency. They are eating these, so now this population is going to decrease, and the bottom level is going to increase because there's nothing eating it. Now eventually it catches up, and all of a sudden this level of secondary that was eating so many of the primary, they're going to run out of things to eat. So if you look at graphs, you can actually study populations and how the populations change if you change the bottom or if you change the top. So there are just two ways of looking at it, and they've pretty much proven that both of these are in action all the time in different ecosystems, some to a greater degree in some ecosystems that are heavily reliant on a limiting amount of producers, and other ones that might have a limiting number of top-level predators, where if those change, it really throws everything off. All right, disturbance. If you have a disturbance, you're obviously going to change your ecosystem in some way. Disturbances can be abiotic, like a fire or a flood, or they could be biotic, like some fungus taking over a tree and wiping out trees in an area. So this I talked about. This is in the book. It explains how a disturbance hypothesis, if it's somewhere in the middle of a disturbance, not an incredibly high level of disturbance that's going on all the time, or incredibly low level, but if it's sort of a consistent amount of disturbance, like a little bit of fungus causing a change in a couple of the tree populations, or little bits of things tend to actually be good. It actually tends to strengthen the diversity of the area and keep the strong surviving. When you have high levels, you might really exclude some things that were slow growers, and if you have low levels, you tend to also wipe out greater parts of the population. So here we have that disturbance where greater diversity, the most species are right here in the middle when there's a moderate amount of disturbance. The high and low ends, chances are you're not going to have as much diversity. All right, we're going to be talking about in class Yellowstone Park, and not just the fire that happened there, but we're going to talk about changes in species in that area and what humans have done to try and get the ecosystem back. It's going to be one of our major dive into this type of keystone species and see what the impact was and how humans can change it. All right, here is that example at Yellowstone. Right after the fire, it looks like, so much life is knocked out. And 1 year later, a lot of organisms, especially these plants, were able to come in and start growing. So I'm hoping that in your head you're thinking about, what is this change called? When an area has a disaster happen to it, and then growth starts occurring again. And hopefully the word that you're saying is succession. And this would be secondary succession because there already was plant life here, there's already soil here, but it encountered a disaster. It encountered fire, and then this growth that is occurring is our secondary succession, which always starts out with plants that tend to be R-strategist or R-selected species, meaning they're good at growing quickly, reproducing rapidly, and reaching a germination rate very quickly. They can spread their seeds well and pass along. So we're going to talk about ecological succession, changes in an area, not just how the plants change, because we usually tend to focus on the plants changing, but it also changes the animals that will be in that area. Primary succession, you've got to have something with no soil. So we think about a beach area. They've done a lot of studies on dunes in Michigan, and they look at, all right, if these sand dunes actually start having some grasses grow, you can actually predict. There are scientists since the very 1899 have written articles about, all right, we can actually predict what will come next. And they usually call it a facilitative succession, which means one species facilitates the next species coming in. They actually alter the environment enough that it makes it better for a competitor to live there, and usually it has a lot to do with the height of the plants because they're shading out and not able to get sunlight to do photosynthesis. All right, secondary succession after a disturbance. So we call our our early arrivals are pioneer organisms, so they may be linked to this. They are facilitating the appearance of earlier species. That is our most likely chance. Or they might inhibit the establishment of something else. They might change the soil in a way that makes it less likely for another species to come in. Or maybe they have no alteration. Pretty much over time, we say that these have very little chance of happening, and the greatest is that when a species is in an area, like moss, it starts to add the first layer of soil. And that first layer of soil is better if there are seeds flying in, like literally wind brings seeds to different places. Birds in their beaks bring seeds and eggs of animals to other places. So typically what we see is that beginning growth of soil actually facilitates. So this is our most likely one. Something that has greater root depth would need better soil. All right, so this is some examples that you can find in the book, and I want to show you this one. So here's this area in Alaska, and we see the pioneer stage with these weeds that are very R-selected species, and then we see more shrub growth, and then we see this elder. Elder is a type of tree growing in that area, and then eventually a spruce, and we would call this spruce our climax community. So each one altered the environment, altered the soil, making it more likely for the next one to survive because of its adaptations. Maybe stronger root systems, better able to use the nitrogens and phosphorus that are in the soil. That we mentioned. Nitrogen level. All right, so we're not just talking about only soil makes the difference or only the climate makes the difference. What we want to look at when we talk about soil are nitrogen levels and phosphorus levels. And those levels, obviously if you have bare ground, those levels are not existent. But as the soil increases, the chances are things are dying into that soil. Organic matter from the death of the grasses and the weeds and the shrubs increases the amount of nitrogen. Nitrogen is present in proteins, and it has to be absorbed from the soil from bacteria that convert gaseous nitrogen into nitrates. So when nitrates are abundant in a soil, chances are you're going to be able to have larger species of plants like the spruce that are our climax community that can take over and that use these nitrogens so well. All right, human disturbance. We are usually the cause of changes in an ecosystem, and we certainly have the greatest impact because we tend to take over and we do what we want with the ecosystem. So we can reduce species diversity each time we inhabit an area and take over because we're wiping something out. We also prevent some naturally occurring. We stop forest fires, and actually forest fires are necessary for some. There's a I'm trying to think what it's called. Maybe it's a Ponderosa pine. There's a type of pine tree that actually needs fire in its life cycle for the seeds to crack open and begin growth. And when we stop the forest fires, we actually stop some of that growth. So there actually are some controlled burns in areas where they know that this is part of the life cycle and they allow it to occur now that they realize that it's a part of the life cycle. All right. What are the factors besides just the soil and besides the nitrogen that really impact the diversity of an area? And latitude and actual space area are two of the biggest factors. Latitude. The closer you are to the equator, the more efficient you are going to be able to use the sun's energy. It is a more direct ray of sun, and the plants are able to absorb those wavelengths of sun and be extremely efficient at photosynthesis. Also, warm temperature and great amounts of water are going to be really important. When the precipitation that falls is water, and it tends to be a very humid area, plants can grow well because there's an abundance of what they need, water and sunlight. When you talk about area, you're talking about how much space is it taking over. The greater space an ecosystem occupies, the greater chance it's going to be diverse. If you have a small area, chances are you're going to have a fewer number of species and maybe not as much diversity. When you have a large area, you probably have a lot of differences in the richness of the soil. The components of the soil, maybe changes even in altitudes, can change a lot of things about that environment and make it possible to be more rich. I already talked about those. All right, climate And so obviously when we talk about climate, we're talking about how much energy can they get, what's the temperature daily, and water availability. So I talked about those. Evapotranspiration, if you haven't seen that word, that means how much water are the plants losing. Transpiration is the pulling of water all the way from roots up a plant and out the leaves. So how much of that is happening in the area? All right, end of video 4. So I want you to look back through chapter 54, add in all those great examples from the text, and come to me with questions.